you, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank my friend from Barrie Springwater, Oro Medante, not only for sharing his time with me today, but also for his passionate conviction on this issue. And it's an issue, Mr. Speaker, that we've seen over the course of the last couple of months has really caused Canadians to galvanize behind this issue of the attestation. And, you know, I'll start off with a question, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not sure that I would get the type of answer that I think I should be getting, but if the other side, the government side, were asked to sign something that they don't believe in to receive government funding, would they? And that's precisely what they're asking Canadian organizations, Canadian faith-based organizations, Canadian community organizations, who do tremendous work across this country, as my friend from Barrie Springwater, Oro Medante, talked about. That's exactly what they're asking them to do, to sign something that they can't fundamentally agree with. And they shouldn't have to, Mr. Speaker, because we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that defends everybody's right for freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conviction, freedom of religion. Everybody across this country has that right. And so here we are, for the first time in the history of the Canada Summers Jobs Program, the Prime Minister and his cabinet, I'm not even sure how this came up, whether it was the minister herself that imposed this, whether this was a decision of cabinet, whether this was a decision of the Prime Minister's backroom operatives, including Gerald Butts, because this sounds very similar to the type of stuff that goes on in Ontario and did go on under Jerry Butts's watch. So, you know, it's mind-boggling to me that we're even at this point. And so when the government introduced this in December, just before Christmas, it created a lot of angst within the communities that apply for Canada Summers Jobs programs. And there was a lot of confusion, Mr. Speaker, about the attestation. There was a lot of confusion about what it means. And if I don't sign the attestation, what does that mean for my Canada Summers Jobs program funding? And so that confusion led to a lot of doubt, and it actually caused the government to step back and try to clarify what the attestation, what the meaning of the attestation was, and that created more confusion, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you that within this envelope, there are rejected applications because of those organizations who refused to sign the attestation or decided that they were going to sign a supplementary attestation, or they were going to impose or put in a supplementary attestation and not check those boxes. Their applications have been rejected, Mr. Speaker. And they've been rejected by Service Canada because they didn't follow the criteria that the government had set out for them. And so what does that mean to those organizations who have received Canada Summers Jobs funding in the past and have applied that funding towards hiring students, towards community organizations, community groups, helping out organizations? They're not going to get that funding, Mr. Speaker. And they're not going to be able to provide the valuable work experience for those young people. Many of them are in university, and that's what's funny about this, is that this is a government who says that they want to help young people gain experience, gain jobs, and yet they impose this ideological values test that has a direct impact on those young people, many of them, as I said, in university, who are looking for summer employment. And it's a big problem. And what is the impact of those students not working within those organizations? Many of them won't be able to do things within the community that these organizations are able to do. And it's not just faith-based organizations that are having a problem with this. Just 2 weeks ago, just before the application deadline, Mr. Speaker, I was on the phone with Dan Dufour. Dan owns EggSmart in Alcona, which is in the riding of Barrie-Innisfil. Last year, he hired 4 Canada Summers Jobs students. He's like, he doesn't have any faith-based problems with this. He has a fundamental individual right problem with this issue, Mr. Speaker. Why should he, and this is his question to me, why should I sign this attestation in order to qualify for government programs that I've received in the past? And I think it's a fair question, Mr. Speaker. So what's the impact to Dan and his business? Well, he's not going to be able to hire those 4 students. And the service levels within his restaurant could potentially drop down. And I know that he's already struggling. He's already struggling because of high tax burdens, high regulatory burdens, having a business in the province of Ontario and the taxes that are happening federally. And so I told Dan, I said to him, I said, send in the application, but put a note again. And I'm sure that his application will have been rejected because of the others that I've received, Mr. Speaker. So this is a real problem. I know the government's trying to twist this, and I've sat through most of the debate this morning. They're trying to twist it and say that, it's not the way it is. Well, clearly there was a lot of confusion when this program first came out. And, for members of Parliament, and this is one of the things that I found out after the election in 2015 when I first started dealing with the Canada Summers Jobs Program, we have a tremendous amount of ability to deal and to allocate funding with respect to Canada Summers Jobs Program and put them in areas where we think that they're going to be best utilized, not just to hire students, but also to provide the type of community programs that exist. And one of them is the area of municipalities. Municipalities generally apply for large funding, and we're hearing stories from across the country where municipalities, in some cases, who hire 100, 120 students are going to be applying for the Canada Summers Jobs Program, Mr. Speaker, because they don't feel, as a municipality, that they need to subscribe to a government value test to get government funding for a summer student jobs program. And so, it's a very slippery slope as well, Mr. Speaker, that we're heading down when the government tries to impose their own ideological purity tests on these types of programs. What's next? Where does this go next? Does it go towards old age security payments for seniors, where in order to be eligible, and I think these are fair questions, Mr. Speaker, in order to be eligible for old age security, am I as an individual going to have to sign an attestation that says I agree with the government's ideology? If I want to apply for employment insurance, does it mean that I have to sign an attestation in order to qualify for employment insurance that says I agree with the government's ideology? It should never, ever get to that point. It should have never, ever got to this point where the government is imposing this purity test on Canadian organizations that do tremendous work across this country, Mr. Speaker. So we heard in the budget this week that there's a lot of money that's going to be flying out these doors. A lot of money is going to go towards organizations that the government will be funding. The Journalistic Fund, for example, they announced $150 million for journalistic funds over the course of, was it 50 or 150? I haven't quite got the number in my head, Mr. Speaker, but are they going to impose the same purity test on those organizations to apply for this funding? We've got $500 million going to a China infrastructure bank. Is the government going to impose their purity test on organizations that apply for that funding, Mr. Speaker? I think not. And so this is a very, very slippery slope that we're heading down. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects the rights of individuals to believe and to think of what they want to think, Mr. Speaker, what they want to believe. And for the government to impose this test, I think strikes at the very core of what this place represents. This place represents generations of Canadians who have fought for us to have the right to believe in what we believe in, to think what we want to think, to say what we want to say within some limits, Mr. Speaker. Those fights have happened and people have died for that. For the government to sit here and impose this on these organizations and these individuals who have a tremendous impact across this country in the work that they do, that many of them will now not be able to do because they will not qualify, because they don't want to sign this attestation, I think is a real shame. It's not just a shame for those communities and those people that it's going to help, Mr. Speaker. It's a shame for our democracy that this government would impose an ideological purity test on Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened to both of the members from Barrie speak on this issue in the last few minutes, and I recognize there's a lot going on at the provincial political level in their region of the country, so maybe they've been a little bit distracted and not been able